This case takes place in the United States and unfolds over several decades. On a cold November day in 1957, police in the small town of Plainfield made a discovery, one so disturbing that it would go on to influence horror films for generations. This is the true story of Ed Gain. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906. He was the younger of two sons born to George and Augusta Gain. When Ed was about 8 years old, in 1914, the family moved to a 155-acre farm outside Plainfield in a remote rural area of central Wisconsin. Ed's father, George, struggled with severe alcoholism and had difficulty keeping a steady job. Much of the responsibility for raising the children fell to Augusta. When George did interact with the boys, it was often through violence. He regularly beat Ed and his older brother Henry, sometimes hitting Ed so hard that his ears would ring afterward. Augusta, however, was the dominant influence in the household. She was intensely religious and extremely strict. She frequently warned her sons that the outside world was filled with sin and corruption. In her view, nearly all women, except herself, were immoral and dangerous. She taught the boys that temptation was everywhere and forbade them from having girlfriends or even socializing with people in town. Augusta often claimed that God would punish society for its sins, and she saw modern fashion, such as makeup or short skirts, as proof that the world was becoming corrupt. Despite this harsh upbringing, Ed idolized his mother. He both loved and feared her deeply. From an early age, he was known as a shy and socially awkward boy who rarely left the farm except to attend school. Classmates later remembered him as strange and withdrawn, sometimes laughing to himself as if he were listening to voices no one else could hear. At home, Augusta kept Ed and Henry constantly busy with chores and strict discipline. She discouraged friendships and punished Ed whenever he tried to form them. While she rarely used physical violence, she would scream at him about eternal damnation, something the young boy clearly feared. As a result, Ed grew up isolated with almost no social life beyond his immediate family. Psychologists later suggested that Augusta's extreme control and religious teachings may have contributed to Ed developing an unhealthy psychological attachment to her. There is one disturbing story from Ed's childhood that appears in some accounts. According to those reports, he once secretly watched as his mother slaughtered a pig on the farm. Some sources claim that the experience created a strange and confusing reaction in the young boy, though the details remain debated. By the 1930s, Ed was an adult working as a farmhand and handyman around the community. He and Henry took on odd jobs to help support the family, especially as their father's drinking worsened. In April of 1940, George Gain died of heart failure at the age of 66. Ed was 34 years old at the time. After George's death, Augusta's influence over her sons only grew stronger. Henry, however, had begun expressing concerns about Ed's intense devotion to their mother. He believed Ed's attachment had become unhealthy. Then, on May 16, 1944, the brothers were burning brush on their property when the fire suddenly spread out of control. According to Ed, the two became separated in the smoke. When Henry failed to return that evening, Ed reported him missing. Strangely, during the search, he led authorities directly to Henry's body. It was found face down in a burned area of the field. Henry had only minor burns, not enough to explain his death. The official cause was listed as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation, possibly combined with heart failure. Authorities ruled an accident, but some witnesses later claimed to notice unusual marks on Henry's head, fueling speculation that Ed may have been involved. Henry's death deeply affected Augusta. Shortly afterward, she suffered a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed and dependent on Ed for care. For about a year, Ed became her caretaker. She briefly recovered enough to leave the house once, and during one outing they witnessed a neighbor beating a dog. Augusta was outraged, but not for the reason one might expect. Her anger focused on a woman who lived nearby with a man she was not married to. Augusta condemned the woman as immoral. Soon after, Augusta suffered another stroke. Her health rapidly declined. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gain died at the age of 67. Ed was devastated. At 39 years old, he suddenly found himself alone in the large farmhouse where he had spent his entire life. In a strange act of devotion, he sealed off his mother's bedroom and the room she used most often, leaving them untouched. The rest of the house gradually fell into disrepair, while Augusta's rooms remained preserved exactly as they had been. After her death, Ed's behavior became increasingly unusual. He spent long hours reading books about death, anatomy, and historical Nazi atrocities. He also developed a fascination with stories about cannibalism and human experimentation. Despite these interests, neighbors mostly considered him odd but harmless. He continued working as a handyman and even babysat children in the community. But privately, something much darker was unfolding. After Augusta's death, Ed began secretly robbing graves. At night, he would visit local cemeteries and exhume recently buried women who resembled his mother. He carefully followed obituary notices in the local newspaper to find potential targets. Ed later claimed he would enter a trance-like state during these acts, sometimes becoming frightened and fleeing before finishing. But on several occasions, he did remove bodies from their graves. To him, these actions were not acts of desecration. In his mind, he was attempting to recreate or restore his mother. He later admitted that he wanted a sex change operation and also tried to create a woman's suit made of real human skin, so he could be his mother using real tanned human skin. Ed fashioned items ranging from clothing to furniture with human skin. He later denied having any intercourse with the bodies, explaining that they smelled too bad. But short of that, he mutilated corpses in almost every other way imaginable. For roughly a whole decade, from 1947 to 1957, Ed Gein's farmhouse became a literal house of horrors. Human bones were littered around his property. He made a trash waste basket fashioned from human flesh. Chairs made of human skin, sawed-off skull tops used as bowls and cups, clothing made from body parts, a belt made of female nipples. He even made a lampshade out of a human face. These are but a few things that were later found. But then he moved on from grave robbing and on to murder. Ed's first victim was Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner in Plainfield. Mary was a divorced independent woman who had moved to Wisconsin from Illinois around 1949. She ran a small tavern on the outskirts of town, but her tavern wasn't just open to anyone. She was a cautious woman, and she only served regular customers that she knew. Making a rather strange comment. After Mary went missing, he said, "She isn't missing. She's down at the farm right now." No one took him seriously. They assumed that he was just making some kind of inappropriate, twisted joke. However, he was telling the truth, and he would strike again. Ed's second victim was a 58-year-old widow named Bernice Warden. Bernice was a lifelong resident of Plainfield, and she owned a hardware store. By all accounts, she was a well-respected and loved woman in the community and a mother of 2 grown children. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, and a daughter. Ed Gein was familiar to Bernice. He was a customer who occasionally bought things from her store. On the 16th of November, 1957, At around 5 p.m., Deputy Frank Warden stopped by to check on his mother in the store. But inside, he found an alarming scene. The cash register was open and overturned, and there was blood on the floor. And most terrifying of all, his mother, Bernice, was gone. Frank found a receipt for the gallon of antifreeze written in his mother's handwriting, and the receipt was made out to Ed Gein. With growing dread, Frank alerted his fellow officers that Ed Gein might be responsible in his mother's disappearance. That very same evening, police quickly located and arrested Ed without any resistance. When officers searched his farmhouse, what they discovered there shocked even the most experienced investigators. Human remains were found throughout the property, along with numerous disturbing objects fashioned from body parts. The scene was so disturbing that many officers later said it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. News of the discovery quickly spread, and the quiet town of Plainfield became the focus of national media attention. During questioning, Gein confessed to killing Bernice Warden and later admitted responsibility for Mary Hogan's disappearance as well. From the skin of human heads, 9 human vulvas, gloves fashioned from human flesh, among countless other atrocities. Law enforcement could barely process the nightmare before them. As you might expect, news of the Plainfield House of Horrors traveled fast, and soon journalists flooded the quiet community. It had become the center of what is known as the most horrifying crime scene in American history. Once in custody, Ed confessed quickly, though he spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. He confessed to killing Bernice Warden, though his account of what happened was somewhat vague. During one psychiatric session, Ed insisted he never meant to kill her. He claimed he was inspecting a rifle on a store rack when it suddenly discharged, striking Bernice before he could react. Ed then pulled her body to his truck and transported it home for his usual ritual of dismemberment. He later confessed as well to the 1954 murder of Mary Hogan, after initially saying he had no memory of it. With those 2 killings accounted for, authorities wanted to know if Ed was connected to any other disappearances or cold cases. Ed was considered a person of interest in several unsolved mysteries. For instance, the 1947 disappearance of Georgia Weckler, as well as 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley in 1953. He was also linked to other possible cases. However, polygraph exams and a total absence of proof eventually ruled him out. Investigators came to believe that Ed's violence was primarily directed toward adult women who resembled his mother. He explained to detectives how he studied death notices and selected freshly buried bodies to exhume. He told officers that he would sometimes snap out of his bizarre trances to find himself surrounded by severed limbs and think, "What am I doing? This is wrong." Yet he kept repeating the behavior. Ed also confirmed the reason behind it all. He was attempting to create a substitute for his mother. He said he stole from graves and murdered these women because he wanted to recreate or replace his mother. Psychologists understood this as a delusional effort to revive his mother, or as he phrased it, yet another mother. His goal was to construct a woman's suit, a full-body costume made of human skin that he could literally wear and transform into a female. He was ultimately diagnosed with schizophrenia and extreme psychosis. Experts believed Ed had been living in a broken mental state for many, many years, possibly made worse by profound isolation after his mother passed. One forensic psychologist noted that Ed experienced hearing voices. Those familiar with Ed often remembered his peculiar habit of laughing quietly, as if listening to someone invisible. Ed himself said he felt compelled by powers outside his control. He told doctors that after his mother died, he heard voices commanding him to acquire another mother or take action to fill the emptiness. During interrogations, an officer named Art Schley grew furious while working the case. At one point, he completely lost control with Ed. Horrified by the atrocities he had witnessed, Schley slammed Ed's skull into a brick wall during an interrogation, driven by sheer fury. But this act of violence against Ed later complicated the prosecution, since Ed's original confession was thrown out because it was obtained under coercion. But by then, Ed had willingly recounted much of his story to other officers. There was never any real question about his guilt. The true issue was Ed Gein's mental state and whether he could be tried. Then, following Ed's arrest, his neighbor, 50-year-old Adeline Watkins, spoke with the press. She told them she had shared a 20-year romantic connection with him, even claiming he once proposed marriage. She described going to the movies and enjoying milkshakes together, and how they connected over their shared passion for reading. Adeline claimed they frequently discussed true crime, yet Ed never talked about his own terrible crimes. She remembered, "We talked about every murder we ever heard about." Eddie explained how the killer did wrong and what errors they had committed. And here is the unusual part. She even described Ed as a good, sweet, kind man. Her own mother confirmed Ed was always respectful and brought her daughter home by 10 p.m. However, after making these statements, she soon backtracked on certain claims. As media scrutiny intensified, she admitted to exaggerating and said they were not involved in a 20-year romance, describing Ed instead as simply a friend. It was determined she was never connected to his crimes, although she stood firm in calling him a decent man. Ed was soon indicted for first-degree murder along with numerous other charges. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Indeed, within days, doctors declared him mentally unfit to stand trial. Ed was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and ruled legally insane. Ed never consumed or had sexual contact with the body parts, despite some rumors suggesting otherwise. Ed was subsequently transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility. He would remain there for the next 10 years, receiving treatment and undergoing observation. For years, Ed Gein lived quietly in the mental hospital. By nearly all accounts, he was an ideal patient, courteous, mild-mannered, and even useful around the institution. In 1968, after 11 years, doctors decided Ed's condition had improved enough that he could competently face trial. The trial opened in November of 1968. Given Ed's notoriety, his legal team successfully asked for a bench trial to prevent juror prejudice. The proceedings lasted 1 week. Psychiatrists offered testimony for both sides. One doctor described how Ed claimed the warden's shooting was an accident and that the gun fired while he was examining in the store. They said Ed was uncertain whether he even consciously aimed at Bernice. But another expert for the prosecution detailed the extent Ed went to in dissecting her corpse and concealing it, indicating he understood right from wrong. In November of 1968, the judge rendered his decision. Ed Gein was convicted of first-degree murder. However, in a subsequent phase concerning his mental state, the judge determined Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity. The result was that Ed would not serve prison time, but would instead remain confined for life in a secure psychiatric hospital. Some considered this punishment far too light. Many believed he deserved execution. He shattered countless lives and inflicted lasting pain on Plainfield. Some suspect Ed killed as many as 9 individuals, though only 2 are confirmed. Ed spent his remaining years within the mental health system, reportedly in relative peace. By all accounts, he was a gentle, even agreeable inmate who rarely caused issues. He even engaged in some therapeutic activities. He enjoyed painting and polishing stones in his spare time. In March of 1958, his farmhouse was sold at auction, but oddly it later burned completely to the ground. The fire consumed the entire structure. The official cause was never identified, although arson was strongly suspected. When Ed heard about the fire and the destruction of his childhood home, he simply shrugged and commented, "Just as well." On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure caused by lung cancer at the age of 77. In death, he returned to Plainfield. He was interred in the cemetery in a family plot beside his mother and his brother Henry.